I'd like to officially call the regularly scheduled Planning Commission meeting of April 9th to order. Please let the record reflect that all Planning Commissioners are in attendance with the exception of Commissioner Ludden, who had a previously excused absence. In Commissioner Ludden's absence, I will ask Commissioner De Almeida to lead us in the pledge. Thank you. So at this point in the meeting is when we would take any public comments. If there's anybody in the attendance who would like to address the Planning Commission on an issue that is not on the agenda, this would be the time. No? Okay. Anyone out there? No? Okay. Seeing none, we will move on. And I believe we have a presentation item this evening.
Yes, we do. David Belmer, our Assistant City Manager, has joined us this evening to provide the Commission with an overview of some of the city's activities on Altora Road. We thought this was a topic you may get questions on as you circulate in the community, and David has certainly spent many, many years working on this. It's very interesting dynamics that occur on Altora Road. With that, I'll let David begin his presentation.
Thank you, Gail. Chair, members of the Commission. What I thought I would do tonight is provide a quick overview. As I'm sure you know, Lake Forest, like many cities in the state of California, used to have a redevelopment agency, and unfortunately that agency was eliminated by state legislation, removing from the city a pretty vital tool in our efforts to revitalize the properties in the project area. And we were required by state law, like every agency that was eliminated, to form an oversight board that would oversee the unwinding, those are the words that the state created, of our redevelopment agency, essentially its dissolution. And that board meets periodically. Now we meet about every 6 months, and we're nearing the completion of the unwinding process. When we first kicked that group off, so to speak, we provided a presentation to kind of provide a history of redevelopment in Lake Forest, some of the things we've done as an agency, and unfortunately some of the things we felt we weren't going to be able to achieve as a result of the dissolution of the agency. It's a relatively short presentation, so I wanted to just kind of quickly, my thought would be that this would be of interest to you as planning commissioners. I know you're out and about in the community a lot, and you're probably getting questions about particularly Altora, and some of the older areas that maybe still need revitalization. Maybe you're saying, hey, Commissioner, why is nothing happening there? It's not exclusively because of the dissolution of the agency, but that's certainly a factor. So I really wanted this, though, to be more of a conversation. So at any point in time, boring you, which I hope not to, just say, Dave, you're boring me. Or if you have a question, please feel free to ask. I have no issue with being interrupted. If a question comes to your mind as we work through this, feel free to interrupt. The redevelopment project area, I wanted to provide a little bit of the history of our project area because Lake Forest was pretty unique in the redevelopment world, and I'll explain why. And some of that uniqueness comes from the history of our project area. The Altora project area was actually a smaller area of a larger county-wide project area because, as you know, we were originally an unincorporated county. And the Altora project area was originally adopted as one of 14 non-contiguous areas by the County of Orange way back in the beginning of time, dating back to 1988. And it was called the Neighborhood Development Preservation Project Area because it was largely residentially based. Altora, the commercial portion of Altora, was really one of the only commercial areas in that larger countywide project area. And I mention that because it's a factor in really what the county was focusing on in implementing that project area, which was really residential stuff. They had largely ignored the commercial corridor along Altora Road as a redevelopment agency, and that showed here in Lake Forest. It was about 856 acres. This is a map of the project area, and as you can see, it extended all the way from the 5 freeway, which is down here on this exhibit, all the way up to Chibuco Road. So this is the shopping center that has the Fresh and Easy shops in it. A couple things to note. As you can see, I mentioned it's largely residential. The county-wide NDAP area was largely residential, as was really the Altora redevelopment project area. So its boundaries are here. This is the whole project area, and you can see all these orange and yellow colors are residential areas. The green, of course, Heroes Park, the golf course, and Altora Park. Certainly, the Altora commercial corridor stands out. That's this area right here. We have this commercial center up at Chibuco and El Toro. And then another area that really had become a focus for the county, and then also for the city of Lake Forest following its incorporation, is what we refer to as the light industrial area, which is the area between the Geronimo Road and the railroad tracks, which is this area right here. Okay, what did we do and how did we come about? As you know, we were incorporated as a city in 1991. And we activated our redevelopment agency in 1995 because one of the driving issues of incorporation was discomfort and displeasure with what the county wasn't doing along El Toro Road. So shortly after the city incorporated, the founding fathers, our original city council, said we must make one of our immediate priorities chiseling that county project area away from the county and putting it in our local control. In order to do that, though, we had to establish our own redevelopment agency, which we did in 1995. And we had to negotiate a series of agreements. This was long before my employment here in the city, but Bob Dunnick, our city manager, was here at that time. Gail's predecessor, Kathy Graham, and certainly Gail, worked for several years at the county trying to negotiate the agreements to transfer that, and they were ultimately successful. And the project area actually came to the city of Lake Forest in 1998, so essentially 10 years after it was formed by the county. And another interesting feature of that project area is that it included a small area in Laguna Hills. So the Altora project area certainly included the map I showed you. It actually crossed over the freeway and included a small area in Laguna Hills. And so we actually had a cooperation agreement with Laguna Hills. We implemented the project area on their behalf. And a lot of what you see out in the project area now is a result of what we did shortly after we formed that redevelopment project area. And chief among those accomplishments was our revisioning strategy. And I say our revisioning strategy, it was really the community's revisioning strategy. So at the time that we were anticipating gaining control of the project area from the county, as is the Lake Forest way, we engaged the community and asked the community to help us create the vision for El Toro Road. What do you want to see out here? And this bullet mentions the revisioning and revitalization strategy, which was really our document, our vision for setting the stage of what we wanted to achieve out there. And I used to refer, when I would make my presentation at the Leadership Academy before we were dissolved, I would tell people, if you're interested in what's going on out in the El Toro project area, I would highly recommend that you read the revisioning and revitalization strategy. Unfortunately, now it's no longer operable. In its legal sense, we think it still has some interesting pieces of information there as the future goes. It was a collective effort. It was actually an award-winning effort. The creation of that revisioning strategy won several awards for how we engaged the community and involved them in creating that vision. We were very proud of that. One of the cornerstone features to come out of the revisioning strategy was the El Toro Road Design Guidelines. And a lot of people certainly ask me, they may ask you as commissioners, how is it exactly the city came to achieve such a unified architectural theme on El Toro Road, which is what we have, as you know, the craftsman style of architecture. That comes directly from the revisioning strategy. That was the idea that came from the community to create unified design guidelines, so it has a unified look, which we did. And those guidelines are actually still operable now. As you know, we have citywide design guidelines. Even though we have a project area, we still use the El Toro Road design guidelines when development projects present themselves along El Toro Road. If we didn't have those, and I know that policy debates often occur as to what the role of policymakers in cities, municipalities should be in helping create visions and those visions. Certainly creating the guidelines along the Toro Road was huge in the success of what we see out there. And I think evidenced by the fact that oftentimes when developers are coming into the city and asking, what do you want to see out here, it's very helpful to say, we want to see this, and you're handing them a document that explains the expectation of what the community desires. We were governed by a series of laws, like every agency in the state of California. Certainly do not want to go into all the details of that, but a lot of questions came up about how did the agency fund its activities? We did that through a form of tax increment financing. And this graph right here kind of explains in very simple terms what tax increment financing was. So the agency was funding its activities from its own funding source, not the city's general fund. And the phrase tax increment means growth. And essentially what occurred is when a piece of property is put in the project area, its assessed valuation is frozen or a base year is established. And as the assessed valuation on that property grows from the point in time it's been put in the project area, that's called a tax increment. And the majority of that increment flows to the redevelopment agency, with the exception of what's in the base year. So anything in the base year still gets passed through to all the taxing agencies that share in your regular property tax payment, and the city only gets a portion of that. The city gets about 15 cents on the dollar if you're not in the project area. Portion goes to the library, schools, all the other taxing agencies. But as you can see from this graph, the theory is over time, the assessed valuation of a project area is increasing, and that's generating tax increment that you're using to fund the activities to improve the project area. And that's basically what we did. But like every agency in the state of California, we had what's called pass-through obligations, entities with whom we had to share that tax increment. And chief among those in Lake Forest was the school district. And so this kind of just gives you a specific example of how we looked on this point. It kind of shows what we were doing in fiscal year 2010 and 11. And you can see we generated $4.5 million in total tax increment revenue in that fiscal year. That's not an insignificant amount of money. Our current operating budget in the City of Lake Forest General Fund is $30 million. But I mentioned we had pass-through obligations. We had to share that money, mostly with the school district. That was $1.5 million. And then we had to set aside under state law, we're going to talk just in a moment about affordable housing, we had to set aside a portion of that tax increment for affordable housing purposes. That was called your 20% set aside. So for example, in fiscal year 10-11, that was about $800,000. And the remaining $1.9 million then was available to fund redevelopment projects and programs to improve the project area. So it was a rather significant funding source. What do we do with that money? Well, historically, I mentioned we had to kind of chisel that project area away from the county, and we had to negotiate agreements that would provide for the sharing of tax increment between the city and the county. And of course, as you can imagine, the county wanted to keep all that money. But our city manager, Rob Dunnick, and those that came before, Kathy Graham, were smart enough to negotiate a deal that said, look, if we're responsible for growth and development in the project area, we should be keeping that tax increment county, not you. And that's exactly how that agreement was structured. And so there was significant redevelopment in the project area, and those tax increment dollars really started to creep up. And our single biggest expenditure with that money was the Altora traffic landscaping and widening project. That was about a $30 million project, about $15 million of which was funded by the redevelopment agency. So the agency made a significant financial contribution to making that project come into reality. These are just graphic pictures that kind of show the Altora Road corridor before and after. As you can see, the picture in the upper left shows what was happening on Altora Road. It was significantly congested to the point that really the traffic congestion was disincentivizing private investment in Altora Road. The centers were dated. They were built in a time, in a dated time, and retail demands and expectations were changing. And so there was definitely need for revitalization. And we're going to show you some of those achievements in a moment. I mentioned affordable housing. Our agency had, quite frankly, a pretty limited affordable housing portfolio, because initially we weren't generating a lot of tax increment. When we started to, we kind of started to ramp up our affordable housing activities, principally by acquiring properties. We have a partnership with Families Forward where we acquired 2 condominiums and we leased those to Families Forward for affordable housing purposes. And on your agenda tonight, we acquired a 4-unit apartment complex on Saguaro to pursue an affordable housing project. And we also used our agency set-aside dollars, our housing money, to fund our housing and rehab loan program, which still exists today. It was, at that time, funded with both tax increment from the agency and our annual CDBG grant. Now we have no agency, so it's only funded by our CDBG grant. So here he is. You Must Go is the cornerstone feature here. So the actual bill that eliminated all agencies was called AB 1X26. They had a subsequent bill called AB 1484, and essentially it eliminated us effective June 1st, 2011. How did that affect us immediately? Well, we were working on some projects at that time where the agency was going to have played a pretty vital role. One of which was the Hunter Court Shopping Center. That's the center that has Ross and CVS. We were in talks with the Orange County library system to improve and expand the Altora Branch Library using agency dollars. That project was halted. There were plans for additional streetscape projects using agency funds in and around the project area, and those funds were halted. And you might have heard that we adopted an action plan for the light industrial area. That plan is still operative. And one of the many recommendations in that plan, we could use our redevelopment agency as a tool to help revitalize the light industrial area. And if you've been out there, you've seen that area could use some revitalizing. That funding source is now gone, so unfortunately the agency will no longer be a partner in helping to facilitate that. So Gail mentioned that you were particularly interested in kind of what's going on along Altora Road, and certainly I know you know what we have done. Maybe we'll focus a little bit more on what we hope to accomplish, although there's a relationship between those two. Certainly the orchard is probably the crowning achievement of the revitalization of Altora Road. And I think it's worth discussing for many reasons. One, again, it certainly embodies the major elements of the revisioning strategy that was adopted by this community. It signifies craftsman style of architecture. It creates a Main Street theme, the way the shops are designed perpendicular to Altora Road. All those things are things that came out of the revitalization strategy. And staff's view, the orchard is really an example of when the developer's vision and the city's vision optimally align, in our view. And I think that shows in the project now. It shows in the fact that the community still embraces that project. It's kind of become one of the center gathering points along Altora Road. The Home Depot Center certainly is another project. The picture on the upper left shows the former Kmart Center. I'm sure you remember that very vividly. And of course what we have there now is the Home Depot Retail Shopping Center. There's shop spaces around Home Depot. A significant achievement in the revitalization of Altora Road. Just to the east of the Home Depot Center is Twin Peaks. And spent a little more time on this to give you an understanding of sometimes how the city's efforts to try to achieve more significant revitalization doesn't work. Twin Peaks, the real estate in this shopping center is owned by the Boheim family. And they are a major landowner in Lake Forest. Their land ownership goes back to well before the city was incorporated. And like many of the major retail shopping centers in Lake Forest, it was a victim of what we call bifurcated ownership. And that phraseology came up if you're at your 5-year workshop when we got to the economic development section of some of the challenging issues we face. You heard that phrase, bifurcated ownership. And what that means is, it can mean a lot of things, but what it means here is the person that owns the real estate, the land, is not in control of the buildings and the leasing and the management of the center because there's a ground lease there. And Twin Peaks was an example of that. The Boheim family, back in the 1960s and 50s, they were not developers, they were farmers. And they did not know how to develop properties. And they were approached by developers that knew how to develop properties and were talked into entering into long-term ground leases. And that's what they did. And the way that works is essentially the owner of the land, the Boheims, they play landlord, and it's called mailbox money, essentially. They just get a rent check every month that pays them for the value of their land. The person, the ground lessee, who owns essentially the buildings and manages the property, controls what buildings go on the site, what tenants go there, what their rent structure is, and is responsible for making that ground lease payment to the fee owner. That bifurcated ownership affected this property for years and years and years. About 5 or 6 years ago, though, the person that owned the ground lease, a company by the name of Kelly Capital, went bankrupt. They defaulted on the ground lease, essentially. And the Boheims then, so what did that mean? It means that meant ownership consolidated into the Boheim family. So there was no more ground lease. So the Boheims at that point in time were in control of their own destiny. And of course, the city staff, under the direction of the council, actually the Redevelopment Agency Board, we seized that opportunity to further our relationship with the Boheim family and talk to them about the potential of revisioning in doing a more meaningful revitalization of Twin Peaks. And we had a number of things in mind. As you can see, the buildings along this west end of this center really turns its back to the Home Depot Center. So if you go back and you read the revisioning strategy that was created by the community, their goal was to, hey, let's meaningfully combine these centers and really make it look and feel like one integrated shopping center. There were a lot of vacancies in this center at the time that Boheims regained control of the property. And we felt there was tremendous opportunity to do something more meaningful there. And so we pitched those ideas to the Boheim family, even offered to help fund some studies and other things that would maybe help them realize what the potential of that land asset was, and we think still is. And we had some specific suggestions in mind. They ultimately chose not to do that. And you may hear the phrase that developers develop. Certainly some developers develop out of benevolence, but most developers develop to make money. It's a business. And what the Boheims did was they went through a pretty detailed financial analysis and concluded that their better bet in the near term, which they were then measuring as 5 to 8 years, was to maintain the property in its current condition, kind of do a paint fix-up thing, and start to collect rent monies, which they really had not been collecting for 30 years because all they'd been collecting was a ground lease payment. And the way most of those ground lease payments worked is they were very disfavorable to the landowner. Certainly this one was. So we were unsuccessful, bottom line, in our attempt to convince the Boheims to look at it more comprehensively. However, there is a silver lining to that cloud. There obviously has been revitalization there. They built a new pad building along Altora Road, embodying the craftsman style of architecture. That's where the Lunda Grill is now, and that certainly helped. They were successful in negotiating a lease extension with Smartco, who did a major rehab of their facade. So the center has certainly improved. Is it as comprehensive as it maybe could have been had we looked at it more comprehensively? Maybe not, but it's certainly better than it was when the Boheims gained control of that ground lease. The Lake Forest Marketplace, this is what I refer to as the Guitar Center property. Same thing. This property is also, the fee is also owned by the Boheim family. And until relatively recently, the ground lease on this piece was owned by a company called J.D. Mercer out of the Bay Area. We felt and still felt like there was opportunity to do more with this property. And so one of the themes you'll hear tonight is we were and still are constantly engaged in a dialogue with property owners and those that own the ground lease to see what we can do to champion improvement and revitalization. We had multiple meetings with J.D. Mercer and attempted to include the Boheim family in that. You have to be careful because of some of the legalities of that ground lessor-lessee relationship. But we gave J.D. Mercer some specific ideas as to how we thought this center could be improved. But they were not interested in that. They were interested instead in continuing to maintain it in its current form and generating revenue off the existing that are there. But if you've been to this center, you probably have observed that it has some challenges. Certainly the pad buildings around the corner siphon off a lot of the visibility. That's a factor. The ingress and egress in this center has always been a challenge. We, the city, fixed a lot of that when we created the traffic signal that links the center to the Home Depot. But you probably have seen, as all of our residents have, that that center intersection is offset. And that creates some dysfunction. And we really wanted to talk to J.D. Mercer and the Boheims about trying to get that signal aligned so that it works better. And then maybe tear down some of the existing pad buildings, reconfigure some new pad buildings, and kind of give the center a whole new fresh look. But again, that didn't happen. So we still think there's opportunity there. We haven't abandoned our hope and aspirations. But right now, what you see is what you get.
David?
Yeah.
Before you move on, can you go back to that slide for a second?
Sure.
I do have a question for you. While this slide's up, is probably the best time to ask it.
Yeah.
The corner, Altora and Rockfield,
Yeah.
Where the gas station used to be before they were widening. Who owns that land on the corner?
It's still owned by the oil company, and it's being remediated by the oil company. That's the apparatus that you see there. And the contamination actually associated with that gas station crosses Altora Road and actually goes into the Hunter Court Shopping Center. So the remediation there is pretty extensive endeavor. But the equipment that was placed there about 4 years ago we're being told, is working. And ultimately, a closure letter will be issued, which means the Orange County Environmental Health Care Agency will conclude the remediation is done. And that will clear the way for the potential redevelopment of that piece. And I mentioned our vision. Our vision was to, even on an interim basis, incorporate that center, that corner piece, into the retail center. Like, hey, look, this building has had some challenges with tenants. Why don't we, there's nothing to stop this from becoming a patio area or additional augmented landscaping. Why don't we try to incorporate this into this building, give this building a kind of a new look, maybe improve the tenant profile there. But again, the challenge a little bit because there's a great difference between these two properties.
Does the oil company own that building, or is that
No.
the Beaumont's?
No.
So they have to work together.
This building is controlled on a ground lease by J.D. Mercer. J.D. Mercer now, by the way, sold his ground lease. He is no longer the entity. There's a new entity there. We're trying to dialogue with them as we did with J.D. Mercer. And we're still hopeful that we might be able to encourage something more meaningful to happen there. And oftentimes, here's another theme that you'll hear. Revitalization, oftentimes in these older centers, the impetus for that is tenant-driven. So an example of that back on Twin Peaks would be the Smartco. The Boheim, the owners of that center, did not initiate the revitalization of the building that is home to Smartco. Smartco did. Smartco came in and said to the Boheims, we want to extend our lease here. Fortunately, they looked for replacement locations outside the city of Lake Forest, which we were certainly not in favor of. And we were encouraging them to work with the Boheims to try to negotiate terms for a lease extension that would keep them at that location. And they were successful, and they negotiated a long-term lease extension. And Smartco was not the exclusive, but a significant funder of their own rehabilitation. We get to Hunter Court, and we talk about Cafe Rio. They're another example of that. And so in these centers like this, if a tenant isn't sometimes initiating the desire to renovate because they feel like they're losing market share, because shoppers don't feel comfortable coming there anymore, it just further complicates the ability to get something meaningful to happen. Because the property owner is asking himself, well, if I renovate the center, am I going to be able to generate additional rents to service that additional debt? If the answer is no, sometimes there it sits in its current form. So I mentioned Hunter Court. Hunter Court is an example of lease.
Can I cut you off real quick one more time? Because it ties into the transition. I understand that the ground lease at Hunter Court also changed a few years ago. Is it the same ownership as the one across the street now, or is it different ownership?
Different ownership.
Okay, I got it.
The fee owner for Hunter Court is the Stafford family, and they've owned it since, I don't know, since the beginning of time. Literally, Father Time sold it to them. And the Stafford family, same thing. They entered into a 55-year ground lease because they were not shopping center owners or developers. And their ownership has remained constant over the long term. There's probably been 4 or 5 different owners of the ground lease. About 5 years ago, it was purchased by a company called George Holdings of Lake Forest. And that was a good thing, actually, because George Holdings actually purchased it to try to make something meaningful happen here. They wanted to actually renovate the center and felt they could. They felt the center was undervalued and had tremendous upside. And so they began to look at ways to kind of do that. And back on the slide, when I was talking about the Redevelopment Agency, they had asked the Redevelopment Agency to be a partner with them to do that. And their specific request of the agency was to connect the center to the signalized intersection at Orchard Way. It's currently not connected because at the time we built the signal here, the city, the ground lessor, George Holding of Lake Forest, his predecessor, had said, that's going to involve an investment of money on my part, and I don't have it. And you know what? Somehow shoppers will find a way in and out of my center, so thanks, but no thanks, which is unfortunate, a huge lost opportunity in our opinion. George Holdings, however, realized that's really key in their efforts to make something more meaningful happen here. I mentioned sometimes revitalization is tenant-driven. Cafe Rio is an example of that. Cafe Rio came to George Holdings and said, we want to take over this corner tenant suite. And those plans were processed through Gail and her staff, approved by the Planning Commission. Cafe Rio, for the most part, funded its own revitalization. There were some contributions from George Holdings. But better way to say it, it was a great relationship of how a new tenant can result in good things happening. Jack in the Box is an example of that. Now the new Jack in the Box is on the corner. But we get a lot of requests from the community as to why can we not connect this center to this signal? And won't belabor you with the details, but the bottom line is to do that, this parking lot has to be completely regraded and reconstructed. It's angled parking now. It needs to go to 90-degree parking. There are driveways at various locations along here that would need to be closed. A centralized driveway, so much what you see when you go into the orchard would have to be constructed in this location. 3 or 4 years ago, it was valued at about $1 million price tag. And in order to do it, George Holding needs the consent of Ross and CVS. And he has been attempting, the principal negotiator for George Holding has been attempting to gain that consent for years and years. Challenge is Ross feels like, well, our customers are getting here now well enough. If you're asking me to help contribute funds, George Holding, to make that happen, I'm not so sure I'm interested. So there are various negotiations even still currently underway to try to make that happen. George Holding's long-term goal is to get the parking lot reconstructed, get the center connected to the signal, and then do some sort of meaningful remodeling to the buildings, because they realize we certainly look a little bit aged and dated compared to the Orchard Center across the street. And that can affect tenants to attract shoppers. If you pull out the revisioning strategy that I keep talking about, its big picture vision was to connect Hunter Court with Altora Square. And the way that would have been accomplished would have been to demolish these inline shops here and cut through right here. That was complicated about 4 or 5 years ago when Tommy's leased this building and did a pretty significant remodel. It's also complicated by the fact in the shopping center industry, as I'm sure you know, the big tenants don't pay much in rent because they're called anchor tenants, and they think they shouldn't because they think they drive shoppers, bring shoppers to the center, and the mom and pops benefit from that, so the mom and pops pay more rent per square foot. So this lease with Ross dates back to, 30 years. So their current rent per square foot is far below the current market rent. But we're not giving up hope. We're in constant communication with George Holdings Lake Forest, and we're hoping we can make something happen there. Bridger Road, we've had some revitalization there, and the best example of that probably is McDonald's. Again, the tenant-driven revitalization. This was really spurred by the fact that McDonald's was making money available to its franchisees because they had adopted a new thematic architecture, which they were, in this case, gracious enough to modify to fit our craftsman style of architecture. We have met with every single property owner on and off along Bridger Road to ask long-term, what is your vision for this area, including Green Thumb. We get a lot of inquiries from real estate brokers about Green Thumb. It's a pretty significant piece of property, and there's been some discussion about the potential of trying to combine that. Might not have that. Do some property consolidation, make that more of a comprehensive project. Green Thumb, though, is pretty happy. They have a pretty loyal customer base, and that's family-owned business, and at this point in time, they don't really have any interest in selling. Orange Tree Plaza is another one, bifurcated ownership. This is also owned by the Prothero, not also, but it's owned by the Prothero family. The Prothero family owns all of the mobile home parks in the city of Lake Forest, with the exception of Forest Gardens on Lake Forest Drive. They also own Orange Tree Plaza. This is Orange Tree Plaza, as you see right here. The person that owns the ground lease is a doctor. He's owned it for years and years and years. We have a pretty good relationship with that doctor. We have talked on and off with him about trying to do something to also refresh this center, maybe look at it from a new perspective. But this center actually enjoys pretty good occupancy. And so he has not been motivated at this point in time to talk about that. So it has not occurred. We also get a lot of inquiries about Altora Plaza East. This is the long center with pad building in the corner. we think there's opportunity. We also think this property is somewhat underserved, that there's certainly opportunity to do something more meaningful here. We have had limited dialogue with this property owner. They haven't been too interested in talking to the city about doing anything here, but again, we never give up hope.
You said the Long Center, that's the CVS now.
CVS, thank you.
Just making sure I'm thinking of the right place.
Yeah, sorry. It's gone back and forth over time, but it is now CVS. This is a real success story, and we wanted to include this just to, kind of talk a little bit about how this came to be. This is an example of a center that it's not bifurcated ownership. It's owned by it was, up until recently, owned by a relatively well-capitalized retail owner, shopping center developer. And I'm sure you remember what the center looked like before it was remodeled. When the shopping center owner first came in to talk to us about it, and by the way, this was also a little bit, though, an example of a revitalization that was spurred by a tenant. Vaughn's closed. And as you know, Vaughn's was closed for years and years. To the shopping center owner's credit, they bought that lease out, which was in the city's best interest and in their best interest in their view, because Vaughn's motivation was just to release it to the person that would pay the most per square foot, and that might have been a tenant that was maybe not in the city's best interest. So we created a dialogue with the shopping center owner to try to encourage them to gain control of that lease space. It took them 2.5 years to do that, but they finally did. And then they came in and started working with Gail and her staff to remodel the center. And suffice it to say, because people sometimes will say, well, what would life in Lake Forest be like if there were no planners? My response is, not as good. Because if we showed you the plan that this shopping center owner first came into with the city, and you compare it to what you see there now, it's worlds apart. So we always try to work with our property owners, because they have private property rights, and we respect that. But we also remind them, you're part of a larger community, in this case Lake Forest, and Lake Forest has established a vision for Altora Road that includes this center. And so pleased to report that we think really turned out well, because they did a first-class remodel. And they have since told us that has actually been, has facilitated their efforts to attract and maintain quality tenants in this center. The questions I most often get on this center is, what's going on with the 76 station? It's individual ownership, as is the Del Taco. That's why those properties were not remodeled or included in this project. But you never know. We never give up hope. And guess what? I'm disappointed to tell you that's the end of my presentation, because I know you want more. So that's kind of a trip down El Toro Road, if you will. I touched a little bit on the light industrial area, and I mentioned that we have an action plan for that area. That also came up with the 5-year strategic plan with the council. It's kind of a living, breathing document. It's the essence of that plan was we work collaboratively with the property owners, and you can get that document and you can read it. Many of we call it an action plan, as we set forth a series of actions, things we wanted to do to help facilitate the improvement of that area. But what it really embodies, though, is the property owner's desire to keep it kind of what it is as a service, commercial, light industrial area, but improve it. Not completely redo it, not convert it to something else, but improve what's there. Those uses serve a purpose in the community, but everyone agrees, including the property owners, it needs some improvement. I got a lot of questions about the Laguna Hills Nursery site, why something more meaningful hasn't happened there. And that's just an example of, I'm sure you know, the property, the Laguna Hills Nursery property was owned by the Matsuoka family for years and years and years. They owned the property and operated the nursery. They eventually realized that the value of their land asset far exceeded the value of the business, and they began to look at options for selling the property. And they sold it to the highest bidder. And the highest bidder was, at that point in time, trying to put together a development for a multi-tenant industrial project. Actually had a plan that was getting ready to come to the Planning Commission. Gail and the planning staff had worked with that owner for over 2 years to try to get that plan together. And then the financing market got tight, and he couldn't finance that project. Eventually lost the property to the bank, and it was taken back over by the bank temporarily, and it was purchased by U-Haul. and I think you know what's happening there. We understand U-Haul is eventually is supposedly going to be coming back in with its plans to try to achieve its development. But we still are focused on the light industrial area, and we still dialogue with those owners regularly to try to do what we can to make suggestions and encourage things. You recently approved an application for a new tow yard there, which will certainly make some visual improvements to what's going on Front Street. So every little bit helps, in our opinion. So that is what's happening on Altora Road, or maybe in certain cases not happening. So I'm certainly here, as is Gail. And Gail has been here, as you know. Gail was introduced as a staff member when I was on the Planning Commission here in the city of Lake Forest. And I won't tell you how many years ago that was, but so she has a lot of background and history on Altora Road, can certainly help me answer any questions that you may have.
Just a quick observation. I live across the street from the Fresh and Easy Shopping Center,
Yeah.
and it is night and day. It's an amazing project, so kudos.
Yes. We're a little concerned, Fresh and Easy, as you know, as a company, is going through a workout. We're not currently on the list of stores slated to be closed. That could change. But if that were to happen, the benefit of a remodel, where the owner and the city have benefited from that remodel is, if Fresh and Easy were to close, I hope they don't, certainly I would imagine that the property owner would have an easier time re-attracting a quality tenant there.
Right. And then the document you were mentioning regarding the plan, game plan,
Revisioning strategy?
revisioning strategy, thank you, for the light industrial. Is that something that you guys could email? Do you have a digital version of it too?
We certainly can. We can make a PDF. Yes, we can get
Okay.
you the
So
light. And
that'd
you'll
be-
see in there, I mentioned a lot of things have been done. One of them was to adopt design guidelines specific to the light industrial area, which we did through the Planning Commission and then ultimately through the City Council. And those have helped. They certainly, I think, help Gail and her staff work with property owners that come in and say, I'm looking at this property, what's the city's vision or expectation? You provide the design guidelines, and I think it really helps the architect and the owner understand, okay, I get it, okay?
Right.
This is pretty clear.
Yeah, I've read through the design guidelines, and we've had a couple projects back there, so we needed to, but that broader picture would be good. So
Yeah.
if someone could email that to me, I would appreciate it.
Sure.
Okay, any other additional questions for Mr. Belmar?
I won't be offended if you don't have any.
Well, thank you very much for coming. And then I just to let the commission know, if you do have a topic of interest to you, we're happy to put together a presentation for you. I think it's very helpful to understand some of the background, and the city has accomplished so much in the 20 years, and we've really looked at a lot of areas, and it's amazing to see the changes in the community over that period in time. So just let me know if there's something you'd like to know more about, and we'd be happy to put something on your presentation calendar.
All right. If there's no more questions or comments, we'll move to the consent calendar. Does anybody want to bring a motion?
I'll move approval.
I'll second.
Okay. Any discussion? Okay. Can we vote? And the motion carries unanimously. Thank you. And that moves us into our discussion item. Do you want to present it, Gail?
No, actually, I'll allow Mr. Belmer. That's the general plan conformance for the proposed sale of property on Saguaro Street.
Certainly. I mentioned that the agency, one of the agency's many obligations was affordable housing, and using its 20% set aside, those were funds designated exclusively for affordable housing. And just prior to the agency's dissolution, the agency acquired a 4-unit apartment project complex on Saguaro Street. And what drew our attention to Saguaro Street was police services and code enforcement activities and some of the unique dynamics we have on Saguaro, and felt we might be able to affect a more positive change there through kind of a comprehensive neighborhood revitalization strategy, where we could, kind of partner up our affordable housing dollars with nonprofit organizations that specialize in operating and maintaining affordable housing. So we acquired this particular property just before dissolution. We since transferred it to our housing authority, as we did all the affordable housing assets that were owned by the agency. We went through a competitive RFP process to select a nonprofit partner. We selected Families Forward. As I mentioned, we have an existing relationship with them for the 2 Madrid condos that they use for transitional housing. The goal was, and still is, as we mentioned in the report, to achieve what we originally identified as the vision for this project, which is to alleviate overcrowding, try to remedy some of the transitory tenant issues we have out there, which create challenges for police services, complete a comprehensive remodel, revitalization, so to speak, of the property, and then put the property into the hands of a nonprofit, not the city, that specializes in operating affordable housing and brings services that assist those that qualify for those units to try to advance themselves. And that's what Families Forward specializes in. Their motto is a hand up, not a handout. And that's what they do with the transitional housing units that we currently have that they operate from our Madrid condos. So this is a prelude to a public hearing that we're scheduled to have with the authority board, Housing Authority Board, and City Council at the next meeting, at which time we will present the actual disposition and development agreement that would sell the property to Families Forward under numerous terms and conditions and restrictions, which the details of which I will not bore you. But that's what this is. So the law requires anytime you're acquiring or disposing of property in your public agency, you need to make a general plan conformance finding, and we do that, we think, in this report, which requires the adoption of the resolution that was prepared for us by our city attorney's office. So I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Dave, that Families Forward, is that Tim Salmon's organization?
No. No. I know what. Yeah, he is. Margie Wakeham is the executive director of Families Forward, and they have multiple people on their board, some of whom are quasi-celebs. But I don't. Tim Salmon is an Angels. Tim Salmon. No. Okay. I know he is involved in something like that, but it's not Families Forward.
I didn't know if it was the same one.
No.
Okay.
I saw Belcor is that up on your list as far as who monitors that or runs that? Is that Families?
Yeah, that center was developed, gosh, I don't know, 10 years, by Trammell Crow about 10 years ago. Certainly when our agency was still in existence, Commissioner Fuentes, and we, at that point in time, I mentioned we were having some difficulties spending our affordable housing money. When Trammell Crow came in to propose that apartment development, we kind of thought, well, this could maybe be a good opportunity to work with them, use some of our housing, and provide some affordable units in that development. And that ultimately was done. And so there was an affordable housing agreement negotiated with Trammell Crow. They're no longer the owner of the property, where 6 affordable units were created, set aside, through an investment that was made by the Redevelopment Agency using its housing funds. Those were 30-year covenants. And we have about, I think, 13 years left on that, 13 to 15 years left on those covenants, and we, to answer your question, we monitor those annually through documentation they provide to us that shows us what families are in the affordable units, what their income levels are, because the 6 units are divided between certain income categories. So we monitor them once a year.
Thank you.
Out of curiosity, in that monitoring, is it just a documentation monitoring, or is there eyes-on monitoring? Or I know you mentioned alleviating overcrowding, and I know one of the things for a while, my own neighbor, 2-bedroom condo, had 17. It probably wasn't 17. It was more like 11 people living in it.
Yeah.
It always seemed like 17 because there was somebody coming and going.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious,
Yeah.
with those affordable units, do we have a little more control to be able to make sure that nobody's put up a false wall in the kitchen and turned it into a bedroom? And
Yes, with the qualification. Yes is a short answer, because that annual monitoring we do requires them to show us what families living in the affordable unit, what their family size is, what their annual household income is, and that includes tax returns. The documentation we get through that monitoring is pretty extensive. Plus the property owner, in this case it's Trammell Crow's predecessor, is certifying that only those number of people are living in that unit. Because if there were more people living there, then we'd have to be counting all the people, all the residents' income gets counted towards their total household income. And if they have more people living there than they should, that would be a problem. Plus, in the affordable deals that we do here, like most agencies, we set an occupancy standard of 2+1. So it's 2 people per bedroom plus 1. So they can't go over it.
Thank you. All right. No more questions? We'll open the public hearing on this issue. I see we have somebody out there. Do we have anybody who has requested to speak on this? Okay. I guess we'll go into, if there's any discussion up here, or anybody wants to bring a motion, or...
Well, I would close the hearing and take staff recommendation to adopt the general plan conformance.
I'll second.
Is there any further discussion? All right, seeing none, I'll call the question. Let's vote. And we are 2 for 2. So, motion carries 4-0. And that brings us to director comments.
I just had one comment this evening. I wanted to inform the Commission that last Tuesday on April 7th, the City Council voted to have staff bring back a resolution to revise the Planning Commission's set meeting schedule, and we'll be moving to having 1 meeting per month scheduled, and that most likely is going to be the 2nd Thursday of the month. And then should the need arise based on applicants and projects that have been submitted, we could hold a special meeting on the 4th Thursday of the month. So that still has to go back to the Planning Commission for formal action, and they will adopt that goes along with it. But most likely will be the 2nd Thursday in the month, and we'll keep you informed about that one.
Thank you. And our city attorney?
I have nothing this evening. Thank you.
All right. Who'd like to go?
That was very interesting, Mr. Belmer. Thank you. Yeah, and, filled in some bits and pieces. I've been around quite a while, but there were still a couple of those little pieces that I didn't have that part of the puzzle. So thank you. Appreciate it.
I really like the David Belmer show. I think we should invite him back. Yeah.
I enjoyed it, David. That's, to me, actually exciting. Too bad it takes so long for it to be accomplished. And I want to encourage the city staff to continue thinking along those lines. And maybe even think of a longer horizon of what would happen more years down the road. Because as we have all learned, that some of those leases are long-term, and so that means that someone has to sit around and think about an idea for a long time. And it would be good for them to kind of have an idea what expectations they might have in the future for increasing the value or the utilization of the property. So if we could kind of use that mindset for our city, I think it would be very helpful. Thank you. Well done.
I really don't have anything to add tonight. I think David hit one out of the park tonight, and the rest of us should just and finish on that. So I will adjourn tonight's meeting to the next regularly scheduled meeting, which at the moment is still April 23rd.
That's correct.